Hi, everybody. I'm Joel Telpner, the Chief Legal Officer for Input Output Global, and I am joined by Charles Hoskinson, the founder and CEO of Input Output Global. And I'm really excited about this because usually the way things work with Charles is Charles will call me up and say, Joel, what the hell's going on with this? So today I get to ask the questions. So I'm very excited, and thanks, Charles, for agreeing to do this with me. Um, so I wanted to start out you know, look, to me, you're one of the real pioneers in blockchain. You were one of the founders of Ethereum. You went on to become one of the founders of Cardano, and you are the founder and CEO of the blockchain technology company IO Global. So I've never had a chance to ask you what what attracted you to this space, and what did you see as the initial promises that made this, I don't know, for you so exciting or cool or different from anything else that was out there?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are really three things that I think are important takeaways to the value proposition of our industry as a whole, and they're sometimes not as emphasized as they ought to be. So we often hear about the blockchain trilemma, but I kind of have a different trilemma that I think about. First off, there's this idea of decentralization. So we live in a global society now. We're moving from a Westphalian notion of nation states to this one big global community, and stuff our neighbor does impacts us. The problem is that we don't really have good institutions and systems to accommodate for globalization. So when you move from the United States plus the global community, how do you solve a collective problem like gain of function research or global warming or the distribution of resources or global inequality, these types of things? You just don't have the right tool set. And how we used to do it is a big empire would form, like the British Empire, the American Empire, or the Chinese Empire. And they would say, this is the way, standardize around our standards. And then suddenly everybody drinks from that cup until they don't. And that's not so good. So you need something different. And blockchain is all about saying, well, you have all these people that have to work together for some reason, for some business process or policy objective. They don't trust each other, but they got to work together for the benefit of a consumer. And whether you're in the telecommunications business or the healthcare business, or you're in enforcing sanctions, whatever the hell it is, there's so many of those things in life, and we don't have good management systems for it. Second, this concept of inclusive accountability. And so inclusive accountability is your ability to check something. So there's so many things in life that you just trust people on and you don't have transparency about. How your money's being spent, whether your vote was recorded properly, if your bank account actually has the balance that's claimed, how supply chains, is this carbon neutral, is this safe beef that we're eating, et cetera, et cetera. You're just trusting institutions and people and hoping that the audit and oversight is good enough to actually give you accurate answers. Well, so many cases in life where that's not true. And we've seen that again and again and again. And these are famous cases from lead in the water in Flint, Michigan, to voting fraud, to other things that have occurred. For example, we see this a lot in Africa when we do business. These governments have democratic legitimacy, some of them. But then when you look at the nature of the elections, 90% voted for the candidate who's currently in a civil war. I don't really imagine that he got that kind of voter turnout, but yet that's what they say. And you can't check or verify these types of things. So inclusive accountability is your capacity and ability to check the record yourself and know that that record is accurate. That's one of the most magical things about Bitcoin and the blockchain space is it introduced this notion at scale. So when I send you a Bitcoin or ADA or Ether, you don't trust me. You have everything you need on your side to be able to verify what I've sent you hasn't been double spent and exists. And now we're talking about how do we extend that to other concepts in society, whether it be voting or supply chain and so forth. And the third part of the trilemma is this concept of governance. So when you have a big system, usually you have a custodian of that system, a central entity like Microsoft to Windows or Apple to the iPhone, or you have a federation like the Linux Foundation to the Linux kernel. But in both cases, it's somewhat hierarchical. With a fully decentralized system, you have this idea of bottom-up evolution, where you have a wisdom of the crowd steering the organic growth of the system, but no one actor is in control and are in charge. And that's a very different way of running a government or governance process than what we're used to. So those three things together are revolutionary, because when you think about it, there is no institution they don't touch, whether it be the quality of your toothpaste, all the way to how do we build a hospital. Each of those things, if they're applied to that process or that institution, you get benefit because you ultimately get more honesty, more efficiency, faster evolution, you get more safety, and ultimately you get more resilience inside these systems. And we saw with 2008, for example, how bad things got when you had hyper centralized, hyper optimized systems where when a mistake was made, it was replicated again and again, and the whole financial ecosystem collapsed. And that's not a good way of going. So we're all about transparency and globalization, resilience. We're all about inclusive accountability. And I saw the blockchain space as a kind of an obvious organic evolution in that particular direction. The other thing is that everything's open source for the most part, and everybody's very collaborative and they share ideas. And there's this Cambrian explosion of innovation that's occurring. And every time that innovation occurs, regardless of where it occurs, it's ubiquitously useful for all of those concepts. So when somebody over off in left field does a zero knowledge proof, I might be able to redo that for an identity system or a supply chain system. When somebody way off there publishes an optimization for a consensus protocol, suddenly I can reuse it now to do higher throughput for microtransactions for my sports betting thing or tipping thing or whatever it is, whatever use case is. So that's just amazing. We don't normally do that. When your neighbor does an innovation that's siloed to their industry and their intellectual property, but here in this industry, everybody shares, and for the most part. And so that means we have a much higher rate of innovation. And that's the other exciting part of it, in addition to the social benefits of it.
Now that sports betting has come to New York, a lot of people are going to be interested in that component. I want to come back to the third prong on governance, but before we do, I think there's another kind of, threshold question I wanted to ask. Do you think so far we've lived up to the promises of blockchain, and if not, what are the impediments that you've seen to date?
Well, I'd say we have some double-edged swords that have allowed us to grow at a tremendous rate, but also have created unrealistic expectations. And so normally open source technology doesn't have an explicit value metric. So the Linux kernel is probably, if we could put a price on it, worth billions to trillions of dollars to society, but we don't. So it tends to attract a special group of people that are more mission-oriented, technology-oriented, and have a philosophy about use and utility. When you put a price point on something explicitly, you create an industry-wide expectation that somehow it has to live up to that and be realizable immediately. So Bitcoin went from nothing to a $2 trillion ecosystem in a 13-year period, and it attracted a huge wave of fair weather people who don't really care about the philosophy, the mission, the values, the social utility. They just care about getting rich. So it created a very strange dynamic where you, in the same tent, you have one group of people that are prepared to be here for decades to see the mission through, and another group of people that as soon as they get what they feel are their objectives financially, they leave. Yet they somehow coexist in the same place, and they create competing demands. So it's impossible to live up to those expectations because they're not realistic or feasible or tangible. Nothing gets 1,000x in a year and is sustainable. You can't keep doing that again and again. Exponential growth doesn't work that way. It will collapse. So on the other hand, it's attracted an ecosystem because of that financial growth of hundreds of millions of people. There is really nothing in the world that was started 13 years ago that a camel herder in Mongolia knows about it at the same time as a guy in Wall Street, at the same time as a vineyard in Chile. I mean, it's extraordinary. I've been to over 70 countries now, and you travel throughout the whole world, and everybody knows about what we're doing. Everybody has an opinion about it, and it's percolating into every industry, like NFTs into the arts and into music and into Hollywood and so forth. It's extraordinary. Everything is being touched. So that valuation, while it carries a lot of negative stuff and many unrealistic expectations, it also at the same time has created a reality where we have gotten to scale faster than any other innovation in human history. Mm-hmm. The internet was the kind of the poster child for how fast you could get to 1 billion users. Blockchain is rapidly beating that benchmark. So I think we have lived up in a certain respect for our growth targets, but not for our expectations of value. And I think we also have lived up for technology. I mean, the rate of evolution and innovation in this industry is beyond anything I've ever seen in any technology. Any challenge, how do we get resistant quantum computers? Let's build a new government. Let's build this. Let's build that. Every 6 months, something comes out. There are thousands of academic papers that have been written, tens of millions of lines of code that have been written, 8,000 plus projects that are all doing interesting things. Every day, there's a new policy paper that comes out, whether it be CBDCs or this or that. And it's really captured the imagination and mindset of so many people, from your 25-year-old engineer that's sitting in Silicon Valley with a nose ring and the blue hair to your 65-year-old banker, JD MBA, who's in charge of a multinational body that regulates something. They live in the same tent and they're innovating in the same tent. It's a pretty extraordinary thing.
I have been thinking about dyeing my hair blue, by the way, but I haven't quite gotten the courage up yet. So, you mentioned the ability to do transactions without having to deal with the trust issue. And so I know that blockchain is much more than financial services, but a lot of applications in the blockchain space, are geared towards trying to democratize and provide and bring financial services to people around the world that have been marginalized or left out altogether from our financial systems, because banks weren't willing to serve them, or banks were just too stuck in their old-fashioned ways. And as part of that, people realized that in bringing financial services to the people that didn't have them, you could bypass a lot of the old intermediaries, and that perhaps a lot of those intermediaries really weren't necessary before, but definitely aren't needed now. But as part of that, and forgive me, so I'm looking at this from a lawyer perspective, but as part of that, when I was in private practice, I would constantly have clients come to me. And the first thing they would say is, okay, Joel, just tell me what country to set up in, because all I want to do is I need the country that's going to be easy, because I don't want to deal with all this regulatory nonsense. So tell me where I can set up so I can avoid all these regulations. And so it seemed to me that the notion of being able to empower people financially to bypass existing financial institutions that weren't serving them was conflated with the notion that simply because you didn't have to use the old financial infrastructure, you also didn't need any type of regulation whatsoever. And,
Right.
and I think that that's hurt our industry, but maybe I'm just being, too myopic in my vision looking at it from a lawyer perspective. But I think that's been a problem for us as an industry.
Yeah, well, first off, the people who lead the industry are young. And when you have young people who have never built a business, never been in a regulated environment, they tend to undervalue or discount the influence of why regulation exists. When you live through something, you're like, oh yeah, I don't want that ever to happen again, so we should probably do something about that. But then the problem is that the next generation doesn't live through that. Yeah. So when the Great Depression happened, there was a whole bunch of people that said, boy, that was really horrible. We probably should do something to not have that happen again. Well, the next generation didn't endure that. And so as a consequence, they tend to undervalue the protections that were put in. So there's this constant struggle between the old and the young, and this constant struggle between the legacy and the new, where basically you have to keep reevaluating, are we doing this because of tradition? Or are we doing this because it's still useful? And useful is always connected to the structure and nature of the environment and the economy. Most regulation was built for siloed markets, the American market, the European market, the Chinese market. It wasn't built with globalization in mind. So, if you're a multinational company, you may have to comply with 60 different legal systems inadvertently. And it's just not feasible. It's not possible, especially if they have interoperability there. So on one hand, blockchain, what it does for us as an industry is it gives us this idea of functional regulation, where the regulation can actually be contextual and library driven. So when you have a customer in Ethiopia, you automatically have a way through software to comply with the standards there. And it just can be baked into that particular transaction and only for that particular transaction. And then as it transfers to Chile and it transfers to the United States or other places, you can either add on or take away, but you kind of build. It's kind of paint by numbers in that respect. That's a two-way relationship. We as entrepreneurs, as an industry, we're real good at research and software, and we can write libraries and we can do all kinds of magical things. And it doesn't take a long time to do that. But then you also need governments to step up and say, we recognize that as legitimate and valid way of doing business. What's not productive is when both sides are at war with each other. So
Yeah.
the entrepreneurs say, well, we don't understand why you do what you do, so we're just going to pretend like it's not useful at all and you're the enemy. And then for the government to say patently absurd things. Like, for example, when I see people say, well, most cryptocurrencies are securities, they should just register. Well, let's actually go through that exercise. What does actual registration mean for a decentralized organization? It's probably impossible. And at some point, people will actually show the reductio ad absurdum of pursuing that and how it's not physically possible to do what they're saying. But just to blindly say that just do this is ignorance of the nature of the technology, the nature of the ecosystem, and the results of globalization. So I can see it from both sides. And I don't by any means think the goal of cryptocurrencies is somehow to get rid of all regulations and get rid of all compliance, because at the end of the day, it's all about consumer protection. It's all about market stability. It's all about transparency. It's all about fairness. And there are many cases our industry has been a bad actor, in my view. And no greater example would be stablecoins, because they hide under the veneer that they're somehow, because they're a crypto asset, decentralized, and the trust model is equivalent to Bitcoin, when in reality, they're custodians. No different than any banking institution or any institution that holds on to something for you. And there's an enormous amount of trust there. And we can look back to the baronial age of the United States, the 19th century. There were more than 200 private currencies in the United States. Almost all of them, within 10 or 20 years of being established, went out of business because they went from full reserve to fractional reserve for the trust and commitments that they made. There's too much temptation to cheat. And we saw this, for example, with Tether, where they publicly said, hey, we're full reserve. Oh, well, we're full reserve if you think commercial paper is full reserve. Yeah. And then maybe we'll give you transparency, maybe not. We're not ready. And that's $70 billion with a turnaround of $100 billion every single day. This is exactly why a financial regulator exists, is to keep people honest in that respect. So there's really has to be a give and take. And I think it's a great reset needs to happen in the relationships of the entrepreneurs and the regulators. And we need to get back down to basic principles of what are the consumer protections they care about? What are the information asymmetries they want to resolve? What are the geopolitical goals that they want to have and the geopolitical rules-based order that they want to propagate? And then ultimately, what technology can be done to automate things and to go from don't be evil to can't be evil. You have proof of reserves with crypto assets. You have all kinds of inclusive accountability, where the view that the regulator will get with a crypto system is superior to any view that they get in the legacy system, which means they can automate things that were previously done through suspicious activity reporting or other mechanisms which are prone to failure. And we know that because all the big guys that are supposed to do it keep getting fined every year. When you're a big bank, you get $10 billion of fines in 10 years for compliance problems. Obviously, the system is not working. So you can't tell me that's desirable over a system that automatically does that stuff and, optimizes things. And so it's a mixed bag in a certain respect.
So, as you know, I very much agree with the things that you said. And those regulators in Washington who say that our existing regulatory system is, number one, clear, and number two, works just fine for the crypto space, I think is just fundamentally wrong. Just as I think that those people in the blockchain industry that think we don't need regulation are also fundamentally wrong.
Right.
But I think to me, the key is that it's not, if you look at all the good players in the blockchain industry, it's not that they're opposed to regulation, but it's a hard thing to do to try to comply with regulations that simply aren't the appropriate regulations for new technologies that never existed before. And when you have something like a cryptocurrency that can, at the very same time, act as an investment instrument like a share of stock, can act like a commodity like a bar of gold, and can act like a form of payment like a dollar, and because it's software, can have all those functionalities embedded in that crypto at the exact same time, and depending on those functionalities may simply vary by who's using them, how, when, and where. You can't take, in my view, historic regulations and assume they're going to work just fine for something that's so innovative and new and didn't exist before. So if that premise is correct, you're an example of a prominent voice in our industry. How do we move forward from taking the people that say no regulation and explaining to them that's wrong, but also taking the regulators that say our existing scheme is just fine and telling them that's wrong. And how do we combine all that to come up with a pathway for an appropriate regulatory scheme and agenda going forward? How do we get there?
Right. So the challenge is that you kind of have to divorce yourself from your nationality. I'm an American, as are you, and the problem with being an American is we tend to believe that whatever we say, the rest of the world automatically just accepts, listens to, and executes. So we're like, okay, how do we change the law in America? And once we do that, then the problem is solved. It's like, well, what about all the other countries? We're America; they'll follow. It doesn't exactly work that way. It used to. We used to be so powerful, like when Sarbanes-Oxley was passed. Like a day later, Australia followed, England followed, and all these other people did. And that was just 2003, I think. So it wasn't too long ago where there was so much geopolitical influence that you could kind of unify it that way. So the problem that frustrates this is that there is geopolitical competition, and some people are actively pursuing, just kind of like the old days with tax optimization, being the jurisdiction of choice to evade a rules-based international order. Other people are being very aggressive at adopting crypto in every facet of life. For example, what we saw with El Salvador in the adoption of Bitcoin. So in this multipolar world where there's not consensus in the League of Nations on how to handle things, it creates problems about creating universal standards. And that's another frustration entrepreneurs have. They're like, look, guys, we have to live in the world. My customers are coming from everywhere. Even if I want to follow the law, it's not possible. At any given, it's like the Schrodinger's cat. At any given time, I'm in compliance and I'm not in compliance. There's at least one jurisdiction where both cases are there. Now, for the U.S. perspective, as a U.S. company, a U.S. citizen, there's two ways you solve it. One is legislative, and the other is judicial. So the bureaucracy is given its toolkit, and they can only operate within that toolkit. At least you'd hope that. Prosecutorial discretion gives them some flexibility, but at the end of the day, if all they have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And what they'll do is start hammering things, and people will object and say that violates the spirit of the law. And so then it gets run through the courts, and new standards are created. That's where the Howey test came from. They passed the Securities Exchange Act in the 1930s and 1933. And they had this nebulous catch-all, this investment contract idea, but it really wasn't well defined. And then people had disagreements about that interpretation. And then 13 years later, the Supreme Court said, okay, well, we'll create a test for you. That was not done through a legislator. It was done through judicial process. We're seeing the same thing occur with the definition of decentralized and the equal application of the law through the Ripple case. And the courts will do their job one way or the other. Now, we might disagree as an industry, but that's where we're at given the current laws. Now, we need the Senate and the Congress to step up and do their job and actually pass a bipartisan piece of legislation that augments and enhances the industry. And there's a laundry list of things I'd like to see. And we beta tested a lot of those things in certain jurisdictions, like the state of Wyoming, where 26 laws have been passed, for better or for worse, to build a comprehensive legislative framework, everything from defining what a DAO is to defining utility token for cryptocurrencies in the United States. That's a good basis to have an argument about how we ought to do it. Now, if you have a fast evolving ecosystem, what you tend to do is try to push a lot of the day-to-day regulation to self-regulatory organizations. That's why FINRA exists and other organizations exist. These things can be replicated and done for crypto. And I'd argue that 70-80% of the day-to-day functional regulation of crypto ought to be done through SROs, both in the United States and international standards. And then you need backbones, and those backbones are set with principles that don't change regardless of the technology.
So I'm really glad.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, there should not exist information asymmetries. There should not exist issues where consumer protection is not a consideration in the day-to-day decision-making. We see agency failures. A great example would be the $10.5 billion of DeFi hacks that occurred in 2021. That was a direct result of people building things, not valuing security, protocol design, or getting it done right, because they wanted to be first to market so they could sell at the top and walk away with money. And retail investors are the ones who got hit with that. So this move fast and break things mentality with a cash rush, and ultimately it hurt the most vulnerable amongst us. So that's an example where a regulatory structure needs to come in and say, there needs to be standards. If you're going to build these applications, they have to be certified against basic things or insured or approved by some notion of quality. And if you can't do that, you can't approach that, well, then you shouldn't be building these things, because ultimately this is going to be holding billions, if not tens, if not hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars of assets long term. And we regulate banks for that reason. We regulate any financial institution for that reason. We have to trust that the things that are being done are decent. The same for information asymmetries. If certain actors in the marketplace can form cartels and trusts and know things before other people, you're back to the Knickerbocker crisis in the 1910s. You're back to the issue that was happening in the 1920s, which led to the creation of the Securities Exchange Commission and other organizations. You're back to why the central banks were created, because certain groups of businessmen were basically able to play one game at the expense of everybody else inside the market. So that's your legislative side. You know, your SRO deals with the day-to-day 70, 80%, because stuff gets invented all the time. But then you bake in and ask, well, what does a standard of consumer protection be? What does a standard of information asymmetry be? And the good news is we have very different ways of handling these problems over the ways we used to. The way we used to is you create a bureaucracy, and then you have the big actors basically be the enforcement arms. So the bureaucracy will say, if you want to be licensed, you must follow this and file a suspicious activity report or do this and this. And if you don't, you lose your license, you get fined, and maybe even criminal conduct. So you have this kind of little big thing where you have a little bureaucracy with big private industry, and it's a public-private partnership in enforcing the model. Our industry is about disintermediation. So we're cutting all of the private interest out, and we're creating regulation that's software-based. Instead of saying the information asymmetry, well, we're going to look real hard and audit you and make sure it doesn't exist, like insider trading provisions. Instead, what you can do is you can have a transparent, inclusively accountable ledger that shows everybody the state of things, and we can verify that you didn't know it before I did with absolute certainty. That's a very different way of doing things, and it doesn't require suspicious activity reports or third-party coercion or these types of things, which are often adversarial to the customer base. The same thing for the quality of software. You can create proof artifacts and show that your software is certified against known standards to verify quality and so forth. And they can mandate that if you're going to deploy this, you need to have these standards. And if you don't, then it is going to be regulated or treated harshly or made illegal or these types of things. So I think you can have your cake and eat it too. And it's a long conversation, and it's an emerging field, algorithmic law and algorithmic regulation. But I think it's the only way to go in a rules-based international order where people have incentives to cheat to get these things.
Mm-hmm. So there's so many there are a couple interesting things that I want to follow up on in what you just said. One aspect is technology as part of the solution, as opposed to technology being the problem. Here, the technology provides solutions for us to better manage and govern potentially. And you also mentioned, the concept of SROs, which have worked quite well in other industries. So if you take those two concepts and go back to the third prong you had mentioned at the beginning of governance, as an industry, what can or should we be doing potentially in self-governing activities, and how can we potentially take self-governance, combine it with our technology and maybe an SRO, and prove to the world and regulators that this industry can operate successfully and prudently and appropriately.
Yeah, well, it's a complicated issue because you're talking about basically a parallel economy. We're effectively reconstructing the legacy economy, but we're doing it with blockchain. So every part of it has its own unique burden of quality and a burden of consumer protection. So, for example, when you look at exchanges, you can look at the exchanges themselves and basic standards about how they operate, behave, and where there are conflicts of interest. For example, these proof of stake coins, a lot of them allow you to delegate into stake. They also, in some, allow you to vote. Well, do you have the legal right to do that? Did you ask your customers if you are allowed to take their voice and their income stream? Most don't. And that's an example of a conflict of interest where you have a financial incentive to behave in one way that is not at the best interest of the customer. Security standards, custodial standards, basically operating exchange that has a low probability of being hacked, and the exchange is insured properly so that when or if such a thing occurs, that the funds can be restored. We have FDIC for a reason, right? And so these are the kinds of things that are example of where exchanges themselves need to evolve. The exchanges have an obligation to regulate the industry in a certain respect where listing standards occur. Before they create liquidity for an asset, they have to ask some basic questions about the nature of it and the purpose of it, and really if that thing is real or not. One of my biggest pain points, and it got me into a pretty big fight with a prominent exchange that shall remain nameless. I was at a party in Hong Kong, and I confronted the head of the exchange about them providing liquidity for BitConnect. And I said, we know this is a Ponzi. Why are you guys allowing people to trade it? Why don't you guys delist it and make a public statement that this is a scam that's harming consumers? And they said, well, they paid us a boatload of money to list, and we make millions a day in trading fees. So that's an example.
Honest about that.
Yeah, I know. Well, cocktail parties, you can be honest. So you see stuff like this and you say to yourself, my God, you don't care that at some point musical chairs comes to an end and a lot of people aren't going to have a chair and it's going to come cascading down, and you're legitimizing this project by providing liquidity for this project. So these are the examples of where SROs, when an individual agency has an incentive to cheat, can enforce a code of conduct across an industry and force them as membership of the SRO to behave in a certain way. For example, listing standards, where they do ask those basic questions about these things. And those questions can extend into software certification about what level of quality assurance and maturity does this product have. And then you can even talk about segregated marketplaces where you have to be of a certain, like an accredited investor or something like that to be able to participate. These are the kinds of arguments that can happen. Then there are other institutions. For example, there's a lot of ratings agencies and people who talk about, and they pretend to be objective about the nature and quality of projects. And it turns out that they actually have financial investments in certain projects, and they're providing information that's highly biased and skewed. This is exactly why there were reporting requirements about your positions and ethical guidelines about how people are supposed to disclose things. In medicine, for example, I'm not allowed to go write a paper and submit it to the Journal of the American Medical Association, but also for the drug I'm recommending or the thing I'm doing, have no shares in that company without disclosing it. That's a conflict of interest because I have a financial incentive to tell you something is good or not good based upon my personal financial interest. So you have to be really careful about where information is coming from and the standards behind that and ethics of the objectivity of that information. Again, I think a lot of that can be addressed and handled through self-regulatory organizations and so forth. But each of these domains, there's hundreds of them. You need to think through best practices. And the good news is that 80-90% of that has been solved in one way or another in the old legacy system. It needs to be taken, dusted off, modernized. And you have to ask the question, well, how can you do this a little bit better and more efficiently and differently in a modern environment? Not the old environment where, there was no computers and everything was on paper. And when you wanted to know something, you had to pick up the phone and hope they answer. I mean, this is a 24/7 global digital first environment. So we have to do things a little differently. However, that requires a productive, positive relationship with the regulator and the bureaucracy of regulation, and for them to actually talk to us and work with us instead of saying our job is to go off to the mountaintop and occasionally come down and throw lightning bolts at you. And you just have to not be where we hit the lightning hits. And sometimes it feels that way. There's anti-clarity that comes. They say this thing is this thing. And then next day they come out and say, well, I know we said that, but we didn't really mean that. We're not going to take a position on it. How the hell do you do anything at any given day of the week? They say two contradictory things. And then you never know where you stand. And then you can't even go and ask them. One thing I love about Switzerland, of all places, it at least is easy to ask the Swiss government. You go, you sit down, you get one of those big famous Germanic beers, you get shit-faced drunk, you talk it out, and then they write something for you. And that's the law of the land. And you get that in a few weeks. That's something. And I think that's the other side of the equation, because there's so many complicated case-by-case things that need to be introduced, and a lot of tough questions about where does liability sit, how do people get restitution, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, the regulator needs to be sitting there drinking with you and talking about these things. And you're both on the same side. You're both trying to solve the same problem. We want clarity. We want to operate. We want to know what the rules are. We want to follow the rules. But what you can't do is say, well, we're not going to tell you the rules, but when you screw them up, we'll sure as hell show up and hurt you.
Yeah, then we'll hit you.
You can't operate that way.
Well, clearly the solution is more alcohol in DC. which we can push this year. I wish we could keep going. Apparently, we hit the end of our time. So the only other thing I want to ask you is, would you like to introduce your lobster friend that's sitting next to you before we say goodbye to everybody?
Well, yeah, this is Logan the lobster. Actually, this is a great example of the power of decentralization. So as a fun thing, I just put a lobster on my microphone. People started talking about it. And then eventually people say, what's the lobster's name? And so we wrote a smart contract, and thousands of people in the Cardano ecosystem got together, participated, and they basically ran this concurrent contract on the Cardano network, and it created a name for the lobster. So it's Logan the lobster. People have written graphic novels about it. They've created NFTs for the lobster. It's created a whole ecosystem around it. But it's a case study in the power of both decentralization and how quickly things can move. You could take a stuffed lobster, and then suddenly it's its own life form, and it has its own history, and it has a market value, probably in the millions at this point in this industry. So it's just mind blowing. But then it also tells you the challenges of regulating something like this, and the challenges of operating in these types of environments. And you can't just set something and say, well, we passed a law, it's done, or there's a court case and it's done, there's clarity. No, you have to constantly be vigilant, and you have to have that partnership and relationship in order for the system to work properly.
Well, for what it's worth, my vote was Krusty the Lobster, but it didn't win. But thank you, Charles. I appreciate having the opportunity for me to get to ask the questions today. This was a lot of fun.
This was a lot of fun too. Thank you so much, Joel.
All right.